Let's speak to Ciaran Browne, an assistant professor in conflict resolution at Trinity College Dublin, also a fellow at the Trinity Centre for Resistance Studies. Ciaran, you're in Belfast. Thank you so much for your time. What are the rules when a residential building is hit? Because the attackers believe that their enemy is inside, but civilians are killed in that attack.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, and I'd like to extend my solidarity to colleagues and friends in Palestine who are being subjected to yet further waves of Israeli bombardment. Yeah, of course, there are purportedly rules governing warfare. International humanitarian law is supposedly exists with the Geneva Conventions as well. These are universal and have been ratified by 196 states, and very few international treaties have this level of support. But let's be really clear here. The deliberate targeting of civilian objects and extensive, unjustified destruction of property is a war crime. Destroying entire multi-story homes, making tens of families homeless, amounts to collective punishment of the Palestinian population and is a breach of international law. And that's been said many times before, including by leading Israeli human rights groups. B'Tselem, for example, have said targeting apartment towers, which are not military targets, and leaving dozens of families homeless is a war crime. And let's also be clear here, even if some parts of buildings are occupied by members of Hamas for alleged military purposes, that doesn't justify wiping out entire apartment blocks. And Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So where do you expect people to go when you make them homeless? And we need to be very clear with our language as well. This is not a conflict. This is about a people struggling for independence, freedom and dignity against an oppressive colonial superpower that is armed to the back teeth.
Okay, Ciaran, you're raising so many points that I actually wanted to follow up on. So it's a perfect introduction that you've given us there. Speaking about the dense population of Gaza, does that become a question of international law regarding any conflict that might happen? I mean, you say I shouldn't use the word conflict. Okay, the attacks that are happening in that densely populated area, is it a question of international law or a question of ethics?
I mean, that's a really good question, to be fair. But let's go back to the core facts on the ground here. This is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and is being subjected to a bombardment, unprecedented levels of destruction and carnage. I don't know if it's an issue of ethics. It's very difficult for me to answer that question. But we do have international law, and your states are expected to abide by those principles of international law, and that's the reality here.
I spoke to Naftali Bennett just before the last election, in which he stood as a candidate to be Prime Minister. And I put it to him that the ICC and its chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, were starting this official investigation into possible Israeli war crimes over the past few years, before the current situation started, of course. And he said to me, all of our soldiers are innocent. And I said, so even the person who shot, and the Israeli army admits that it shot that nurse a few years ago who was on the border between Gaza and Israel, who was treating protesters who were being injured by Israeli gunfire, who was shot and killed. So even that soldier is innocent. And he said yes. So we clearly know the feeling amongst the top Israeli politicians about accountability when it comes to their forces.
Absolutely, and let's look at the International Criminal Court as an example. You know, this is supposedly the avenue that you can go down to to hold people accountable for breaches of international humanitarian law. But this has long been avoided by Israel and by the United States. So let's be clear on that as well. But in recent times, there have been moves by the ICC to begin investigations into possible war crimes committed by Israel in Palestine. But let's be frank here, accountability under international law is rarely, if ever, achieved. Look at the many times that the West have been engaged in alleged war crimes, for example, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and no one's ever been held accountable. And there is a large body of thought there amongst critical lawyers that says that international law is really just an extension of Western imperialism. So I wouldn't expect in any way that Israel will be held accountable for its actions. The ICC will not or should not be viewed as some sort of panacea in terms of holding rogue nations to account. The only way that I see accountability of some sorts being provided is if there is a dramatic shift in international relations and global opinion, which results in sanctions, which may in turn force a rethink.
Okay, that's absolutely critical. I'm so glad you mentioned that as well, because when you look at the list of countries that do not recognize Palestine as a state, so you've got almost 140 countries out of those that make up the United Nations, and then you've got those that, so about 140 that do. Those that don't, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, South Korea, Japan, Canada. Is this basically about the balance of power between those international actors that don't recognize Palestine as a state, and therefore implicitly are possibly supporting Israel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're bang on the money with that. But it's also about other nation states suggesting that colonized people do not have the right to resist and do not want to admit that people who do live under colonial conditions do have the right to resist. And this is affirmed, by the way, by the United Nations under Resolution 37-43. So it's very clear that in order for there to be any sense of bringing this to some reasonable conclusion, there needs to be a shift in attitude from the United States, which props up Israel, which provides more military support to Israel than it does for its own citizens' healthcare. And when you look at, and when you consider, for example, Joe Biden was number 2 to Barack Obama during the 2014 Gaza war, which saw over 2,200 Palestinians killed, I think it's safe to say that we know what Joe Biden is going to do or not. And it will also require a shift in attitude amongst the media and a change in mindset and language when we refer to the situation in Palestine.
Brendan, thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Brendan Ciaran Browne from Trinity College Dublin.